Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to hearing number 14, which is on the impact of fiscal policies on access to housing in the United States. And this hearing was requested by the National Homelessness Law Center and the University of Miami School of Law Human Rights Clinic. I want to welcome the representative of the state, Ms. Lily Calafell, as well as representatives of civil society and the invited expert whom will be shortly joining us online, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. The objective of today's hearing is to raise awareness on the range of international human rights concerns associated with US government policies affecting unhoused and housing insecure populations, as well as the government's efforts and challenges in fulfilling its obligations to advance the right to adequate housing. With me, members of the plenary, members of the commission, starting with Commissioner Pochak to my right. Commissioner Pochak is the first vice president of the board of the plenary. Commissioner Rallon, Commissioner Demise, special rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights, Mr. Javier Palumo, and my name is Roberta Clark, and I am the U.S. Country Rapporteur. Welcome, Mr. Rajagopal. I think you're with us now. Happy to see you. Okay, so just a few introductory notes to just say that after 2 years of preparation, we are really so happy to be holding this session at the University of Miami, which allows us to meet in person with students and individuals committed to the defense of human rights. Significant challenges exist in our region from north to south, east to west, to the full realization of human rights and the strengthening of democracy, as well, of course, as around the question of defense of rule of law, including international rule of law, which is why it is essential to continue working with determination and commitment as we move forward for more just, more equal, more free society. Before I begin the hearing, I would like to ask everyone to respect the speaking times, and I will indicate that now. Let me see. So we start with civil society. We will have 20 minutes, and the state has 20 minutes. We will ask the UN expert to speak for 7 minutes. Then the commission will have no more than 20 minutes to ask questions or make comments on what we've heard. Then we have a response of 10 minutes from civil society, as well as 10 minutes from the state, should they choose to use it, and then we close the session. From the perspective of accessibility, I would like to say that we want to ensure that this hearing is as inclusive as we can make it in the context of the technology available to us. We ask all participants to begin their presentations by stating your name, your position, and your organization that you represent. And as I say that, to remember also to speak not so rapidly, because the interpreters are doing their work. And every time you take the floor, we ask you to remember to also repeat your name. These hearings are available online on Zoom, and for those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can access the interpretation by using the interpretation button, and also you can access subtitling. And those of you who are in the room who need interpretation can also request an interpretation device, and if you don't have it and you need it, I suggest you do that now. Okay, so I think we are about to begin having the preliminaries out of the way, and I would like to ask representatives of civil society to start their presentation. We don't have the clock. We usually have the clock on the wall, but I will use this to give you your 3-minute warning when you reach minute 17. So thank you very much.
Not on. Now it's on. Great. Thank you so much. My name is Tamar Ezer. I'm the acting co-director of the Human Rights Clinic and the faculty director of the Human Rights Program at the University of Miami School of Law. We are very grateful for this opportunity to present on access to housing in the United States. This hearing could not be more timely. We're currently in a housing crisis. In 2024, the number of unhoused persons on a single night reached the highest ever recorded and has increased by more than 18% from the previous year. Rent has also increased at the fastest rate since 1986. Currently, more than half of renters spend over 30% of their monthly income on rent and are just one event away from losing their homes. At the same time, we're seeing unprecedented budget cuts and slashes to welfare and housing assistance. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, Mr. Rajgopal, has addressed the impacts of these budget cuts on housing and homelessness, and we are very honored to have him with us here today. Additionally, homeless service providers are required to accept anti-immigrant restrictions and to reject gender-inclusive and diversity programs in grant agreements. And this is for funding that's already committed from the federal government. Otherwise, they risk shutting down and disrupting critical services. Not only are current policies deepening the housing crisis, but we're seeing a double violation with increasing criminalization of homelessness or activities essential for survival, like sleeping in public. In June of 2024, in the Grants Pass case, the US Supreme Court held that punishing people for sleeping outside, even when there are no shelters available, does not violate the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. And since this decision, over 200 cities have passed and strengthened camping bans. Then just this summer, in July, there's been an executive order 14321, ending crime and disorder on America's streets. It targets people who are unhoused or with mental health conditions for involuntary commitment. It prioritizes funding for camping and loitering bans, and it defunds evidence-based programs like Housing First, which provide access to housing without preconditions. The US is further exporting these laws regionally. We've seen recently that Ontario, Canada, passed a law making it easier to arrest and exile unhoused persons who are suffering from substance use disorders. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn over to my colleague, Eric Tars, who will further discuss the situation on a national level.
Thanks to the commissioners for granting this hearing and the U.S. government for joining us. My name is Eric Tars, and I serve as the Senior Policy Director at the National Homelessness Law Center. I'm here today to raise the alarm. The homelessness crisis is at its highest level ever because our president is pushing policies that will simultaneously make more people homeless, and then these newly homeless people will be subject to incarceration, involuntary commitment, and forced labor in remote government-run detention camps, all just because they cannot afford the rent. As you have heard, the right to adequate housing is in a chronic state of violation in the U.S. Even before the Trump administration's budget cuts and attacks on unhoused persons, the federal government was only meeting the affordable rental needs of 1 in 4 poor renters, meaning 3 in 4 renters was paying unaffordable rates, and more than 200 cities and dozens of states have passed laws criminalizing sleeping in public just in this past year. Many of the state laws are based on a template legislation from a billionaire-backed lobbying group, the Cicero Institute, which has worked to pass criminalizing laws all across the country. And while these issues impact across race, gender, and ability, homelessness disparately impacts Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people with disabilities. And once on those streets, Black unhoused persons, for example, are then up to 10 times more likely than white unhoused persons to be cited for sleeping outside and other related offenses. But while these things have been going in the wrong direction at the state and local levels for a long time, President Trump, backed by the Cicero Institute, has now moved anti-homeless policy to the center of his national agenda. Trump is using the same playbook with homeless citizens that he has used to arrest undocumented immigrants and force them into detention camps like the so-called Alligator Alcatraz facility right here in Florida. Using dehumanizing language in order to stoke fears and lay the basis for a law enforcement-based approach to homelessness, Trump issued Executive Order 14321 in July, which directed housing and healthcare funding agencies to prioritize grants for localities that criminalize homelessness, lower barriers to forcing unhoused persons with mental health disabilities into involuntary commitments, including by redefining the gravely disabled standard to simply being unable to afford housing, meaning we will be depriving individuals of their liberty, potentially indefinitely, just for being poor, and to shift funding from evidence-based housing approaches to prejudice-based shelters with high barriers and compliance requirements. Then in August, Trump sent the National Guard and federal law enforcement into DC to, quote, get rid of the homeless under bridges. While police have often violently evicted homeless encampments in the US, never did I think I would be seeing armed military personnel dismantling the tents of Americans who simply cannot afford the rent. Then, first in September and again just on Friday, the Department of Housing and Urban Development issued a funding application under Trump's executive order that will likely make 170,000 of the most disabled, vulnerable people who have been housed homeless again, and deny funding to homeless service providers in jurisdictions that do not criminalize homelessness, cooperate with immigration enforcement, or who have made programs more welcoming to LGBTQ+ unhoused individuals, particularly trans youth who are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. At the state level, Utah's governor issued his own executive order pushing the state to align its homelessness policy with Trump's, increasing criminalization and accelerating plans for a remote 1,300-bed mega-tent homeless detention camp outside of Salt Lake City. At least 800 of the beds would be on locked units, and because residents of the remaining beds would be subject to arrest if they needed to sleep or shelter themselves once they left the facility, they are effectively detained in the camp as well. Some of these beds have been deemed work-conditioned housing, meaning that individuals will be forced to labor in order to maintain their housing, a trend that we have seen in other state legislation as well. We call on this commission to hold the U.S. to account to prevent these violations of human rights to liberty, opinion, movement, due process, health and housing, fair work, and protection from arbitrary arrest and cruel and unusual punishment for America's most vulnerable citizens. I'll now turn to David Peary for a local focus.
Thank you for this opportunity to present on the human rights abuses of the USA's criminalization of homelessness and poverty. My name is David Peary. I am the founder and the executive director of the Florida Coalition to Advance Racial Equity, otherwise known as FCARE. FCARE advocates for productive solutions to end homelessness, and we work to guarantee that safe and habitable housing is a human right for all residents of the USA. We oppose laws that criminalize homelessness and punish people who are too poor to afford a home. And as Eric mentioned previously, these criminalization laws have a racially disparate effect, as black people are 3 times more likely to be homeless than white Americans. Criminalization violates basic human rights of freedom from arbitrary arrest, liberty, and due process. Criminalization compounds a daily trauma of poverty, and most importantly, does not address the root causes of homelessness, namely poverty and unaffordable housing. Now, a little bit about me. I am a lawyer, but my most important credential is that of a person who has personally experienced American homelessness. I became homeless in 2008 due to the American economic recession, a job layoff, and eviction from my apartment. I quickly learned that homelessness is not caused by bad choices, not caused by personal failures, such as drug abuse or mental illness. In fact, homelessness itself often caused substance abuse, as unsheltered people will self-medicate in order to provide solace from the daily trauma of living on the streets, exposure to theft, violence, and arrest. And sleep deprivation that results from homelessness can cause and exacerbate mental illness. Homelessness is intensely traumatizing. I was constantly vulnerable to violence and theft, particularly from police. Police who act more as a predator than protector are constantly trashing and depriving people of their possessions, such as cell phones, identification, and the items needed for assistance with daily living, such as walkers, wheelchairs, and walking canes for the frail elderly. Due to criminalization laws, the homeless can never find a safe place to sleep. And this is extremely important. We can never find a safe place to sleep for fear of arrest. And so they suffer constant sleep deprivation with concomitant results on your mental acuity. Within the past 5 years, the cities of Miami and the city of Miami Beach have passed laws that increasingly deprive the poor and homeless of fundamental rights. Miami prohibited service of food to groups of the homeless, except under highly restrictive circumstances, thus using hunger as a weapon against the poor. This creates a humanitarian crisis of hunger among the unsheltered homeless in the majority poor and black sections of Miami. In 2023, the city of Miami Beach passed a law authorizing police to arrest the homeless for sleeping in public spaces if they refuse shelter. But the city prohibits shelters from operating within its boundaries, thus forcing the homeless to choose between arrest or deportation away from the city of their residence. Since enactment of that law, Miami Beach has launched a relentless campaign of mass arrests and deportations of its entire homeless population. The homeless accounted for nearly half of all arrests in the city last year, and these arrests are for the crime, quote-unquote crime of loitering or sleeping in public spaces. One person was arrested 150 times within the last year. This has a disproportionate effect on racial minorities. Although black people are only 18% of the county population, they are a staggering 60% of the homeless population. And in early 2024, excuse me, I just lost my notes here. And in early 2024, Florida passed a statewide law prohibiting localities from allowing the homeless to sleep in public spaces. That law also sets the framework for the homeless to be placed into detention camps outside of cities. And this is why addressing homelessness is critical to preserving American democracy, because these detention camps will not be limited simply to the homeless, but to anybody who can't afford the outrageous rents within cities. So we ask that you please hold the United States accountable for this criminalization of poverty, this criminalization of homelessness, and making it a crime for people to exist who simply cannot afford a roof over their heads. I will now turn to my colleague, B, who will talk about productive solutions to ending homelessness.
Thank you, David. Thank you to the Commission for holding this hearing. My name is Alexandria Bia Bartle. I am a law student and part of the University of Miami's Human Rights Clinic. Affordability is not an accident of markets, but the result of fiscal choice. When housing costs force families to sacrifice food, healthcare, or safety, unaffordability becomes not an economic failure, but an issue of human rights. This unaffordability of basic needs is not inevitable, but a product of fiscal priorities. Criminalization of homelessness is expensive, costing 2 to 3 times more than ensuring access to affordable housing. Criminalization shifts budgets towards law enforcement, courts, jails, systems that were never designed to address these social issues. A study by the Central Florida Commission on Homelessness found that local governments spend nearly $49 million a year cycling unhoused people through jails, emergency rooms, and hospitals. Over a decade, and that gap adds up to nearly $500 million wasted. Criminalizing homelessness reinforces the very hardships it claims to address. Arresting someone for sleeping outside does not change that they have nowhere to sleep. It takes away what little stability they have, often costing them their belongings. It saddles them with fines and fees they cannot pay and gives them an arrest record that makes it harder to get a job, harder to enter shelters, and harder to secure housing. In the end, nothing about the arrest addresses their lack of housing. It simply recreates the conditions of poverty and homelessness that led to the arrest in the first place. But it does not have to be this way. We have examples of evidence-based policies that work. A wide body of research shows that housing first, an approach that provides permanent housing immediately and without preconditions, leads to greater stability and low public costs. For instance, in Charlotte, North Carolina, research found that a single person cycling through jails, emergency rooms, and shelters cost taxpayers more than $40,000 per year, with little improvement in stability or health. However, when the city redirected its spending towards More Place, a housing first program, emergency room visits dropped by 78%, hospital days dropped by 79%, and jail days dropped by 84%, saving the community nearly $1.8 million in just 1 year. Housing First programs show that when fiscal policy invests in long-term housing solutions instead of short-term fixes, entire communities benefit. Several fiscal approaches have expanded access to affordable housing by keeping land in community use, reinvesting public funds locally, and creating stable, long-term sources of revenue. In Burlington, Vermont, public funds were used to purchase land and hold it in trust for the community. Families can lease homes on land through long-term renewable agreements, while ownership remains collective. This protects people against speculation and ensures that every public dollar continues to serve the community needs over time. Montgomery County, Maryland decided that affordability should not depend on the next election or grant cycle. They created a housing trust fund permanently financed through a portion of property tax revenue and loan repayments. That single decision has created and preserved more than 10,000 affordable homes and leveraged hundreds of millions in private investment. And in New York City, fiscal design produced an entirely different model of ownership. Through low-cost public loans, property tax exemptions, and public land transfers, the city built a sector of limited equity cooperatives that remain permanently affordable and resident-owned. This model began in the 1950s and 60s under programs which financed large developments such as Co-op City and Penn South. Decades later, these communities still provide family-sized, deeply affordable homes. These models succeed because they prioritize people and address needs, and fiscal choices extend beyond housing construction. They determine whether we build systems of support or systems of control. Fiscal policy can entrench inequality or it can dismantle it. We hope the Commission can call on the U.S. to enact policies that address the root causes of homelessness and ensure access to housing for all. Thank you for holding this hearing. We look forward to the dialogue and to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much. You did have 2 more minutes, but I think you'll have a lot more minutes in any event. I would now like to turn over to the representative of the state to make its presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner Clark. Distinguished commissioners, petitioners, and secretariat staff. My name is Lily Calafell, and I am the Deputy Political Counselor with the U.S. Mission to the Organization of American States. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to begin by reaffirming that the United States takes the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its role within the OAS system very seriously. We have and continue to actively participate in the Commission's meetings, hearings, and expert consultations. While we will not be offering substantive views today and won't be in a position to answer any questions, we have listened with interest to the presentation and testimony of the petitioners and witnesses and will convey this information back to the agencies of our federal government to handle the matters at issue. Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you very much, Representative of the State. And now I turn over to the UN expert, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. You now have a little bit more time, sir, if you want it. I would say 10 minutes. Please start.
Honorable members of the Commission, delegates of the Government of the United States, members of society, in July year, together with the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Olivier de Schutter, I raised concerns about massive budget cuts proposed in the fiscal year 2026 budget request. The administration's proposal envisages slashing funding to the housing and urban development, affordable housing, and homelessness assistance programs, including the continuum of care and other vital community development programs. Alarmingly, this proposal would dismantle or drastically reshape the systems that millions of low-income households, including families, persons with disabilities, and older persons with lived experiences of homelessness, rely on to secure and maintain adequate and stable housing. These cuts come at a moment when the housing crisis in the United States is more acute than ever, manifesting most severely in the unaffordability of housing, which in turn leads to homelessness. Very few can afford to buy new homes. The share of first-time home buyers fell to 21%, the lowest on record since 1981. And according to the United States Census Bureau, nearly half of all rented households were cost burdened in 2023, meaning they spent more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And Black American renters are more likely affected. Households headed by older persons or persons with disabilities are disproportionately at risk to be severely cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on housing costs. Despite the harsh reality, budget request by the administration calls for an unprecedented 43% cut to the HUD rental assistance program. The result will lead to even more homelessness. On a single night in 2024, nearly 800,000 people experienced homelessness across the United States, the highest ever recorded. To propose dismantling the very programs designed to prevent, reduce, and end homelessness in this context is deeply concerning. Emergency and short-term assistance, though critical, do not suffice to help families overcome chronic homelessness. Without investing in permanent housing and long-term supportive services, many families and individuals will cycle in and out of homelessness. I'm also troubled with the decision to shut down the Interagency Council on Homelessness, a coordinating body that has long played a central role in driving federal strategies to end homelessness. Eliminating risks making an already catastrophic situation even worse. Equally concerning is the trend towards criminalizing homelessness, accelerated since the Supreme Court decision in Johnson versus Transpass last year, which is fundamentally at odds with international human rights law, as I pointed out in an amicus petition to the court. Criminalization policies penalize individuals for the state's failure to provide them with adequate housing rather than address the root causes of why people are without homes in the first place. These measures not only violate human rights, they are also wholly financially inefficient. Resources on criminalization law enforcement cost even more than emergency housing assistance and could be better allocated towards housing solutions or long-term rental assistance. Instead, the budget proposed for 2026 calls for unprecedented and deep cuts to housing, rental, and homelessness assistance that threaten to weaken essential support systems that help the most vulnerable avoid evictions, persistent housing instability, and stay off the streets. Many would be forced out of the already limited assistance currently available to them and end up on the streets. There are estimates that number would be more than 170,000, as we heard. Such large numbers would in fact make it more expensive to provide housing, and many local governments would face a financial, social, and political crisis. While the United States, like many countries today, face significant housing challenges, the solution cannot be to dismantle programs that serve the most vulnerable or to focus efforts and resources to remove people from the streets without providing them with adequate alternative housing. I believe that the United States has the means as well as the obligation to more effectively confront this crisis. Efforts and resources should focus on addressing the root causes of housing instability, including the lack of legal recognition of the right to adequate housing, uncontrolled eviction and displacement, and massive housing shortages, and instead expand access to adequate, affordable, and stable housing. Adequate housing should be guaranteed for all without discrimination based on race, migration status, sexual orientation, or gender identity, or any other permissible grounds. While negotiations for the approval of the final budget for 2026 are still ongoing, I urge decision makers involved to align the budget with the United States international human rights obligations and solutions that actually work. I thank the American Commission for this opportunity to share my views and stand ready to engage with the government of the United States constructively to help address these issues. Thank you.
menos desarrollados, escuchar que esto también ocurre en países desarrollados o con tanto dinero como en Estados Unidos. Pero he también quedado muy choqueada por la persecución y la criminalización que están denunciando, ¿no? Que haya personas viviendo en situación de calle, como usualmente se dice, ¿no? No es algo que en las Américas no estemos acostumbrados a ver, pero escuchar que se encarcelan, que se penalizan, que se internan forzosamente, que se establece el trabajo forzado, yo estoy absolutamente choqueada y no podemos naturalizar que esto ocurra. Realmente no puedo concebir que exista una política criminal destinada a perseguir a estos sectores tan vulnerables. Me pregunto cuál es el bien jurídico que está atacado cuando se recurre al derecho penal en esta situación y pensar que la política es aislar a estas personas, encarcelarlas, llevarlas a un lugar para que no las veamos, para que la sociedad no las vea. Eso nos recuerda a otros momentos de la historia de la humanidad, ¿no? Estoy realmente muy choqueada. Me pregunto, han dado algunos ejemplos, prefiero terminar la tarde y estas audiencias con alguna propuesta, ¿no? Y han dado algunos ejemplos que funcionan, ¿no? Han mostrado primero estudios sobre el costo financiero, sobre el costo presupuestario, cuánto más costoso es encarcelar y tener personas enfermas en situación de calle que cuestan dinero en los hospitales, etcétera. Cuánto más costoso es eso que pensar en un programa de vivienda asequible. Y entonces prefiero que nos dediquemos a ver cómo es esto posible, ¿no? Porque es posible, es una cuestión de decisión política, ni siquiera es un tema de recursos, es un tema de decisión política. Y entonces me pregunto, ¿cuáles son esos requisitos que se deben dar? ¿Cuáles son ustedes que tienen estudiado dónde funcionaron, cómo funcionan? ¿Qué es lo que ustedes recomendarían para que nosotros podamos ayudar no solamente a Estados Unidos, sino a otros países para ir en esa dirección? Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Pochak. Commissioner Rallon.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Tengo varias preguntas. Quiero agradecer la información y a los solicitantes de esta audiencia, así como saludar a la representación del Estado. La evidencia que ustedes han recogido en comunidades determinadas ¿podrían establecer o tienen algún dato de qué medidas fiscales pueden generar como el mayor obstáculo de acceso a una vivienda adecuada? Es decir, dentro de todo lo que ustedes han estudiado, si tuviesen que poner cuáles son las que generan el mayor obstáculo como medidas fiscales, que nos pudieran comentar. También quisiera preguntar qué experiencias positivas, mencionaron algunas, pero qué experiencias positivas han identificado donde las políticas fiscales hayan tenido un impacto documentado en incrementar la oferta de vivienda accesible. Si también tienen algún dato de cuáles podrían ser las más positivas. La otra pregunta que tengo, y pues si no hubieran nos pueden hacer llegar la información si no la tuvieran, pero la otra pregunta que tengo es, ¿qué poblaciones consideran las más afectadas por los actuales diseños fiscales? Y si dentro de sus estudios hay un desgregado de datos que pueda respaldar la evaluación que han hecho. Y la otra pregunta es, ¿qué desafíos se encuentran para acceder a datos de inversión fiscal o distribución de incentivos tributarios o uso de fondos públicos en programas de vivienda? ¿Es una información que es de fácil acceso? ¿Es fácil encontrarla o hay algo que mejorar en el acceso a la información? Y mi última pregunta es con una visión, digamos, constructiva. ¿Qué recomendaciones proponen para mejorar la efectividad de las políticas fiscales en la producción, mantenimiento y acceso de vivienda, con base a los estudios que ustedes han hecho y el trabajo que han hecho? ¿Qué recomendaciones propondrían para mejorar esa efectividad de las políticas fiscales? Únicamente, presidente.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Avalon. Commissioner Denise?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to state representative of the state and representative of civil societies and the audience. I want to start off with a report that was produced by the Commission and the Rapporteurship on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Because I think this hearing is so important as we look at how do we proceed and how effective are we in that process. A report of 2023 published by the Commission, a report on economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights of persons of African descent, states the following. The Commission has found that homelessness in the United States disproportionately affects Afro-descendant communities due to structural racism, poverty, and intersecting forms of discrimination. Data shows that Black Americans comprise nearly 40%, and I think I heard the number is higher, of unhoused populations despite being about 13% of the total population. Barriers include persistent discrimination in access to housing, employment, healthcare, and social services, exacerbated by punitive law enforcement and criminalization of survival in public spaces. The Commission and its special rapporteurship urge the adoption of right-based intersectional policies, including affirmative measures and targeted social protection to guarantee Afro-descendant people access to adequate and culturally appropriate housing, and to ensure their meaningful participation in the design and monitoring of housing policies. It's 2025, we have this hearing, and based on what we've heard, nothing has changed, it's gotten worse. Question to the civil society: how can the state improve social safety nets, fiscal policies, and public programs to address the structural drivers of homelessness? To the state, there are two questions. To what extent do fiscal and public policy decisions transparently incorporate input from affected communities, and how are their needs balanced against broader economic and political objectives? Has the state, second question, considered the differentiated impacts of homelessness on vulnerable populations when designing and implementing policies in this regard? Thank you. I yield the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Denise. Over to you, Special Rapporteur. This is your subject matter area.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Personas comisionadas. Yo soy Javier Palumo, relator especial sobre derechos económicos, sociales, culturales y ambientales de esta Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Agradezco a la parte solicitante, a la Universidad de Miami, de organizaciones solicitantes, y también agradezco la presencia del Estado, del ilustre Estado, en esta audiencia. Quisiera partir de una idea central. la falta de vivienda no es un problema de seguridad. Constituye la violación de un derecho económico y social claramente vinculado con situaciones de pobreza y desigualdad estructural. Se encuentra también atravesado por decisiones de política pública o la ausencia de decisiones de política pública que incluyen aspectos vinculados a decisiones fiscales y económicas de los países. En el trabajo de la Comisión y de la Redesca hemos señalado que las personas sin vivienda adecuada, en situación de calle, en refugios temporales o en alojamientos precarios, se encuentran en una situación de vulnerabilidad estructural que exige una protección reforzada y respuestas por parte de los Estados, y no respuestas de carácter punitivo, sino respuestas orientadas a garantizar el derecho a la vivienda. Al mismo tiempo, hemos constatado que el acceso a la vivienda, a la salud, a la educación, depende de aspectos referidos a las políticas fiscales. En el día viernes vamos a tener una audiencia temática de oficio, específicamente sobre políticas fiscales. Depende de cómo se recauda y cómo se gastan los recursos públicos. Cuando prevalecen ingresos insuficientes, sistemas tributarios regresivos y un gasto social mal focalizado, los estados ven limitada su capacidad para reducir la pobreza y la desigualdad. Desde esta perspectiva, la política fiscal no es neutra. Puede ser una herramienta poderosa para contar con recursos para garantizar los DESCA, los derechos económicos, sociales, culturales o ambientales, o para profundizar las exclusiones y la desigualdad. En el caso de Estados Unidos ya se ha mencionado, la Comisión se ha pronunciado en relación al derecho a la vivienda en informes. También hemos tenido la oportunidad de contar con audiencias previas donde se abordó la temática de la crisis de la vivienda, pero el panorama que hoy se describe por parte de las organizaciones parece un poco más grave, sobre todo frente a un aumento de normativas de distinta naturaleza que penalizan actividades de supervivencia, operaciones con enfoque securitario para remover personas en situación de calle, entre otras características que han sido descritas por las organizaciones en la audiencia de hoy. También las organizaciones han puesto foco en cómo estas medidas afectan en forma desproporcionada a algunos sectores específicos, aspecto que es especialmente preocupante. Este tipo de respuestas punitivas no solo no se ha mostrado eficaz para abordar las causas estructurales de la falta de vivienda, sino que además resulta difícilmente compatible con los estándares interamericanos amparados por la Declaración Americana, la Carta de la OEA y el Principio de Desarrollo Progresivo de los DESCA. Tal como lo establece la Carta de la OEA, ratificada por Estados Unidos el 19 de junio del 51, los Estados miembros, de los cuales Estados Unidos obviamente es uno de ellos, han convenido que la igualdad de oportunidades, la eliminación de la pobreza crítica y la distribución equitativa de la riqueza y del ingreso exigen dedicar sus máximos esfuerzos, entre otras metas básicas, a, cito textual, asegurar vivienda adecuada para todos los sectores de la población. Esto está en la Carta de la Organización de los Estados Americanos y es un instrumento de carácter vinculante. En este marco quisiera formular una consideración y una pregunta. La consideración en relación al Estado, dado que se ha hecho una manifestación que implica la imposibilidad de responder preguntas en esta audiencia, voy a sugerir, proponer, en mi carácter de relator especial a esta comisión, la elaboración de una carta artículo 41 para poder obtener más información sobre esta temática en el marco de un intercambio más profundo. A las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y a las personas con experiencia vivida en relación a esta temática, se han comprometido en la lucha por el derecho a la vivienda, les pregunto si desde su perspectiva cuáles son las reformas fiscales y presupuestarias prioritarias a nivel federal, estatal y local para avanzar hacia un modelo que garantice ingresos suficientes, un gasto social progresivo y el acceso efectivo a una vivienda adecuada para las comunidades más afectadas por el racismo estructural, la discriminación y la pobreza. Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thanks. I hope you all have been taking note of the lots of questions. I just have a few myself as the country rapporteur. I just want to remind that this is not the first time we've had a hearing on housing in the United States. We had one, I understand, I wasn't on the commission then, but the 182nd period of sessions, there was also a hearing on the situation of the right to housing. And my understanding from the notes of that hearing is that the state did appear and acknowledge the seriousness of the issue and also acknowledge the need to expand access to affordable housing. But the state was very clear at the time that it the state did not consider it had an international legal obligation to recognize the right to housing. So I wanted, first of all, to get your sense on whether or not, what's your response to that, but also whether or not there is an international legal obligation to recognize the right to housing. I wanted to find out whether there's anything approximating such a right to adequate housing and or to social protection under your constitutional arrangements. That's the first question. Then secondly, whether or not there's a right to housing, there's certainly a right to due process guarantees, particularly in the context of detention. And so I think I do agree with Commissioner Pochak. It's a bit shocking to hear what we're hearing there, persons who are detained. And my question is, are they detained pursuant to a charge? And if they are detained pursuant to a charge, are those charges heard and determined? And what is the average time frame for the hearing and determination of the charges? We know under the Inter-American standards that pretrial detention should be preserved for situations where there's a flight risk or where a person at liberty would cause some complications to the hearing and determination of the matter, which doesn't seem necessarily to pertain here. So on what basis are these pretrial detentions being continued? And then we think of homeless people, I suppose there's a sort of a profile of someone who's homeless, usually a man, I think, and usually a single person, whether a man or woman, a single person. You've given us statistics on the number of people who are homeless here. How many, do we have any numbers on families as opposed to individuals? Not, I mean, it's all very serious, but I'm asking about families because I'm concerned. What happens to the children? Do they go into detention too? And what kind of detention is it? And in this detention, do they have access to education and healthcare and everything that we know is in the best interest of children? Thank you very much. And so now we have about I would say 35 minutes with the time given by the state to respond, and you can apportion your time. And state, I'll turn over to you for 5 minutes if I understand that will be adequate for you.
Yes, I'm here to listen and take all the questions back to the relevant agencies.
Thank you very much. So you have about, I would say, 35 minutes, right? Yes, 35 minutes, representatives of society.
Thank you to the commissioners for these questions. First, I do want to say, while I do appreciate the appearance of the State Department, the fact that they are not here to answer questions, either from us or from the commission, undermines this process, which is supposed to be a dialogue. That's the purpose of these friendly hearings. And it hurts not only for us as civil society, but it shows poor leadership from this country on human rights, only emphasizing this shameful trend that started earlier this month when the U.S. declined for the first time of any country around the world to show up for their own universal periodic review at the UN Human Rights Council. So it's disappointing, to say the least. In terms of responding to some of the questions, to the point about the U.S. And its commitment to the right to housing and where it has worked in the past. The human right to housing is not a foreign concept for the U.S. This is something that came out of the original push for the international human rights regime initiated by the U.S. together with many other countries after World War II. And President Roosevelt at the time said that the U.S. has adopted a so-called Second Bill of Rights, including the right for every American to a decent home. That right was never enshrined into law, but it served as the rhetorical basis for many of the policies that he put into the New Deal and then later into the Great Society programs. And so we have the building blocks for the human right to housing here in the U.S. We have public housing. There's a huge investment in affordable housing, mostly for white families through the GI Bill and through federal mortgage assistance, but that was explicitly denied to black families up until the 1960s. Most Americans today live in some form of subsidized housing, but many white Americans don't think of it as subsidized housing. They get a tax deduction for their mortgages. That's a very hidden subsidy, whereas this, and it's just baked into the tax code, so it doesn't have to go through an annual appropriations process. On the other hand, renters who are predominantly black and other people of color, the subsidies for their rental, they predominantly are renters, and those subsidies do have to go through an annual appropriations process. So whereas white families can get a tax break for owning their home by right, black families, there's an undersupply. As I said, only 1 out of every 4 people who are income eligible for those rental subsidies actually gets them. So we have the building blocks, but we have set up these barriers to it being enjoyed by all people. I would also add, where has this worked before really well? During the pandemic, we saw 30 million Americans were at risk of losing their homes. We didn't see a giant increase in homelessness then because an eviction moratorium was put in place, because emergency rental assistance was sent out at levels that were adequate to meet the need, and people were able to stay in their homes getting that emergency rental assistance rather than becoming homeless. And so we know, and the child tax credit that was created during the pandemic also kept many people in their homes. We have the building blocks in place. We just aren't choosing to fund them at the appropriate levels. Instead, we are now living in this Orwellian world where the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is supposed to be helping ensure that no American goes without housing, is instead proposing to kick 170,000 people who were homeless, got housed, and now will have their subsidies ended because of the policies that they're proposing. And to Commissioner Demise's points, this will have a hugely disparate racial impact. In fact, while the Commission has called, and the rapporteur report that you mentioned, call on the U.S. to implement targeted policies to remedy historical discrimination against marginalized groups, the new funding application that HUD just put out, that HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, put out just last week, forbids groups from targeting resources to historically marginalized populations, requires them to only, penalizes them if they use any other formulation of sex other than a binary, which is going to mean they can't even follow current US regulation, which requires them to treat people according to their own self-professed gender identity. So following current law will actually prevent service organizations from getting additional funding. All of these positions are going to increase homelessness rather than decrease it, punish those, it's going to impact all Americans, but those who are already vulnerable, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQ populations, and disabled people are going to hurt first and hurt worst. I'll turn over to Tamar to say a couple words, if you want, on some of the statistics.
Sure. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you very much for the questions. We really appreciate you engaging on this issue. I just wanted to share a few statistics in response to Commissioner Rallon's question about who is being impacted. So first, in terms of race, and Commissioner Demise, you were completely right on. It is, despite making only 14% of the overall population, Black Americans constitute 32% of the unhoused population. For Hispanic and Latinx persons, they make up 19.1% of the US population and 31% of the unhoused population. Indigenous peoples experience homelessness at a rate more than 4 times of the general US population. So it is indeed a racial justice issue, and we also had the opportunity to present before the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which put out strong concluding observations in 2022, specifically calling for abolishing laws that are punitive and that criminalize homelessness, and redirecting funding from criminal justice responses to housing and shelter programs, and for ensuring the affirmative obligation to fair housing. And we haven't seen any movement at all. In fact, we've seen backsliding since 2022. I also want to say a word in terms of intersections with gender. So gender-based violence is oftentimes both a cause and consequence of homelessness. And about 80% of unhoused women with children previously experienced domestic violence. And 57% of women surveyed said that the domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. So that is an enormous issue. I also have a statistic from 2022 that domestic violence programs were unable to meet over 6,748 requests for housing services. So we've also seen cuts for our shelter programs, leaving many survivors without essential protections. As Eric said, there's also a very strong correlation with LGBTQ+ individuals, and I want to share some statistics there as well. LGBTQ+ youth experience homelessness at a rate that is 120% higher than the overall population, many in large part to family rejection. And in terms of the numbers, let's see, I had 40% of unhoused youth population are LGBTQ, despite accounting for only 5 to 10% of their overall population. So you can see the disparities and the need for gender-sensitive programs, which right now many service providers feel prohibited from doing. Additionally, I want to flag that formerly incarcerated individuals have a very hard time accessing housing and are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general public. So that's another population. And we've also seen, actually, in terms of studies of eviction rates go up when there are children. So instead of being protective, it is a risk factor. And in response to the question about, and thank you so much, Commissioner Clark, for the question about right to housing, I also wanted to point that there are very active coalitions and movements at a local and state level moving for protection and legal recognition of a right to housing. We're working with groups in California that have introduced and are continuing to introduce an amendment to the California Constitution recognizing a right to housing, and they said they'll do it every year until something like that is recognized in law, and there's similar coalitions throughout the country. Connecticut New York. New York does have recognition of right to shelter. It does not go far enough as to recognize adequate housing, but is a start. And Puerto Rico is the one place that does have legal recognition of a right to adequate housing. Thank you.
So I can quickly buttress some of the points that Professor Ezra made here. Commissioner is right. The typical poster child face of the homeless is that of, say, a black male in his mid-40s who is like a drug abuser and just basically irresponsible and chooses to live out in the streets. And that is a pernicious, invidious, racist myth, okay? We find that in reality, the fastest growing group of the homeless are older Americans, are the elderly, or senior citizens. Individuals 55 and older are now represent nearly a third of all homeless in the state of Florida, nearly a third. You ask what happens, also drivers of homelessness are individuals aging out of the foster care system. Once you turn 18 years old as your birthday present, you're kicked out of your foster care facility. Some facilities will have an extra 3 years, and so they'll delay until 21 before rewarding you with ejecting you out. After a year, 44% of all individuals aging out of foster care are homeless. As Professor Ezra also noted, people returning to society from prisons find themselves homeless as well. Within a year, roughly, I think 45 to 50% of all ex-offenders find themselves on the streets. And of course, that has some very negative repercussions for recidivism as well. So we need to disabuse people of these myths that the homeless are personally irresponsible. And a good way to do it is to look at it through a racial equity lens. When you realize that black Americans, black people, are 3 times more likely to be homeless than their white brothers and sisters, okay? Not 3 times more likely to be drug addicts. Black Americans are not 3 times more likely to be mentally ill. Black Americans are not 3 times more likely to be just personally irresponsible. That takes the focus away from the myth of personal irresponsibility and forces one to look at the systemic, the inequitable systemic factors that drive people into homelessness. People don't just fall into homelessness, they are pushed into homelessness because of inequitable systems. A quick note here also about solutions and barriers. And let me talk about barriers. The barriers to solving our homelessness problem are not economic barriers, they're political barriers. We know what it takes to end homelessness. We have 40 years of experience since modern American homelessness began during the Reagan era in the early 1980s. We know exactly what it takes to end homelessness. Homes, plain and simple. Homes are what end homelessness, not substance abuse programs, not mental illness rehab crisis facilities, but homes. And as Bea had talked about, we have tremendous success with Housing First. Housing First is both a concept and a program where you put someone into housing with no preconditions, but you connect them with case management services. You stabilize them. After a while, the fog lifts, and it has tremendous, tremendous success. We know this. We have 40 years of experience on this, okay? So this is no surprise. Our system is working exactly as constructed. These are intentional policies that push people into homelessness that we have now. Now, we not only know what it takes to end homelessness, the United States has the resources in homelessness, and that was demonstrated during the COVID years. I was shocked by March of 2021 when I took a tour through downtown Miami, and I saw that literally every vulnerable person had been taken off the streets and placed into hotels, motels, or other temporary places that served as a bridge to permanent housing. But once the COVID crisis was perceived to be over, boom, back onto the streets again, okay? So I learned a very big lesson there, that homelessness is not accidental, it's intentional policies by our policymakers. So A, we know what it takes to end homelessness. B, we do have the resources to end homelessness because we know the incarceration costs 3 times more than it takes simply to put somebody into housing. Okay, so we have the resources. The only thing that we lack is C, the political will. That's the only thing that we lack.
Thank you for the question on families specifically. I would just like to comment that on a given night in 2024, 259,473 people and families experienced homelessness in 2024, which was a 39.4% increase from the year prior. So this is absolutely a issue impacting families and women-led households. But HUD family option studies have showed that when families receive permanent housing subsidies, there are fewer shelter stays, less food insecurity, and higher child well-being than those in transitional or treatment first programs. In regard to fiscal policies that need to be implemented, I won't point to a specific one, but I will say that it needs to get away from profit-focused models. We have an expansion of opportunity zones, is what I think that they are called. So in areas where they would like to build up tourism, they will give discounts and tax incentives for big corporations to come build. And that does not fix the situation, even if they are making affordable housing. It increases the value of homes without actually adding more value to homes. And it just brings in outsiders to take profit and then leave the communities that they were initially asked to build. So it is taking away the profit models that the United States bases their housing models on and putting it back in the hands of it being a human right. It is something that we need, not something that we need to sell. Thank you.
And then returning to the question from the commissioner about the children and the families, one of the problems that we see is, as David said, the stereotype of American homelessness is an older American, a male who's addicted to drugs, but that is not the majority of people experiencing homelessness. They are only the ones who you're most likely to perceive as homeless, because other families, they are doing everything they can not to let you know that they're homeless. They're hiding it, but that's kind of the silent majority. But when we make our homeless policy about arresting people who we think don't deserve our help, we're making that policy impact everyone who experiences homelessness. So yes, heads of families are getting arrested. The children don't go into detention, into jails, they go to foster care, which, as David said, then often leads them into their own homelessness once they become adults. But we are separating families just as they separate families of migrants on the borders. They're separating families of Americans experiencing homelessness, just as they are putting people on the border into detention camps like Alligator Alcatraz. That's what they want to do to the most vulnerable citizens. This is the first sign of the increasing authoritarianism of this government. The policies that they tested on undocumented non-citizens are now moving to the poorest, most vulnerable citizens, and we can see they are telegraphing who it will come for next in their policies. People who are, don't adhere to their vision of what gender and sex look like, to racial minorities, to people who disagree with them on political points. So this is, we are trying to raise the alarm here because we see it happening to this population that we care about, but it's because we are also trying to prevent something much larger from happening. So that's...
May I also quickly address the penalties? I believe someone asked a question about the penalties for somebody who's being arrested for sleeping in public. because that's like not really a property crime. It's not a violent crime. You know, it's more like a jaywalking type of crime or loitering. People arrested for sleeping in public spaces typically spend somewhere between 24 to maybe 72 hours in jail at the most. They're typically out within 48 hours, depending on what time that they're arrested. And research data shows that they return back to the same places where they were arrested because that's where they know about. That's where they've been sleeping. And so then they get rearrested again. And so here where you see the futility of arresting people for homelessness, you simply get into a cycle of arrest, a brief stay, release, recidivism, followed by arrest, a brief stay, recidivism, and rinse and repeat. And so that's what we have over and over and over again. And that's why criminalization is just so futile.
But at the same time, because these are often misdemeanor arrests, under the American system of justice, you aren't entitled to a lawyer for those crimes. And even if you are released after a short stint in jail, you can be sentenced, in some cases, to 6 months, a year in jail. And in the state of Kentucky, you can now be punished by up to 6 years in jail. It's because Kentucky also is a felony disenfranchisement state, you can permanently lose your right to vote just because you don't, and so you are denied your ability to participate in the political process as a result of this. Kentucky also, their statewide law makes it a legal ground to stand your ground against a homeless person. If there's a homeless person on your property and you try to kick them off and your perception is that you are in any way threatened by them, you are authorized to use force, including deadly force, to get that person off of your property. So these are laws, again, these are choices that our American government is making, that our state governments are making, our local governments are making, not to prioritize the needs of their own citizens, not to help them get into housing, but instead to threaten them with death, with expulsion, and with jail, and fines and fees that, again, just make it harder to exit homelessness.
Thank you very much. Mr. Balakrishnan, Rajagopal, do you wish to say anything as we come to the end of our hearing? You can have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very generous of you. I just reiterate my support for virtually every point that has been made by the civil society members. But also reiterate my belief also that what is really missing in the United States when it comes to dealing with housing as a human right is the lack of political will. We have seen, as was pointed out during the period after COVID, that evictions were stopped. People who were on the streets were given assistance. Additionally, protections were in place to ensure that even landlords who actually suffered perhaps adverse consequences as a result of the measures taken during COVID had access to assistance. All this is possible. And I hope that the government of the United States, as well as the state governments, which have authority over local governments, end up changing their attitudes. And for that, public participation and transparency are critical as components of local government approaches to housing. Part of the problem is the lack of awareness of, first of all, even housing as a human, and secondly, existing programs that might exist that can be accessed and be defended when first measures are taken to eliminate such programs. So, for example, under the financial year 2026 budget request, the funding for HUD's eviction protection grant program is not to be eliminated. It won't be there anymore. Now, it's a new initiative launched in 2021, which for the first time actually focus on the fact that the way you deal with homelessness is not just looking at it as a supply side problem in housing. That is, it's not a problem that simply calls for more construction of housing, more housing. Of course, more housing is required in many contexts, but we have to keep people from getting evicted in the first place. That is the creation of the problem in the first place. The demand side has to be looked at. And eviction protections are extremely important. But what I found is that systematic eviction tracking is even missing. Data, for example, on eviction is extremely hard to come by. Local governments don't have a mandate. In Boston, where I teach as a member of the faculty of the urban planning department at MIT, it was only a few years ago that the city government established the Housing Stabilization Office, which does deal with tracking of evictions, for example. I really encourage, first of all, better data gathering, disaggregated data gathering to highlight all the vulnerable groups, including women, young people, LGBTQ individuals, including young individuals, as well as disabled individuals, which I find is a very big part of the population that remains homeless in the United States. When I did a study visit to San Diego on the invitation of local groups, and also the city council members a couple of years ago, and I was quite shocked by the percentage of disabled individuals who are actually part of the homeless population, and also the fact that there are so many who are older, above 55, for example. It's a very critically vulnerable population, and I hope that there is a better data gathering principle, so local decision makers can come to understand who is really adversely affected within their own communities and populations. Um, with that, I would say that it was, I think, a mistake to get rid of the Agency Council on Homelessness. But I hope that under the current administration, things approached as a problem to be solved rather than as an opportunity to be exploited, which may be tempting in the short term politically, but will not solve the problems and also will create more negative consequences, including, I'm afraid, even politically as a result. It's not a vote getter to not solve housing. And I would hope that the consequences of what we are seeing when it comes to changes that I have seen in countries that I have visited in Europe, for example, Netherlands, Ireland, we have seen similar changes happening in other countries as well. The measures that were put in place 2-3 years ago to deal with housing as a problem caused by largely external actors, including especially migrants, and then to politically exploit it, did bear consequences that the were doing it expected. It didn't need to, political support. In the problem we solved. That's the bottom line. The housing did not improve. So then it starts blowing the other way, and it's not a winning proposition. So I would strongly urge that how we approached as a real problem as well as an opportunity to together scientific basis, and one that involves all levels of government, not just the federal government, but state and municipal governments and civil society groups as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raja Gopal. Representative of the state, you have time if you wish to make any statement.
Thank you, Commissioner, and my commitment is to turn over all this information that we've heard here today to the relevant agencies that cover housing issues in the United States, as the State Department, of course, is not a domestic-facing agency.
we will be sure to relay that information back. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to share them as well.
Thank you very much. I want to end this hearing by thanking the requesters of this hearing, which I think we received a lot of valuable information, and I think we've asked you questions more than you've been able to perhaps address. And so we remain open to receiving information that you're going to send. I want to recognize Special Rapporteur Palumo's suggestion of an Article 41 letter that will allow us to deepen the inquiry and also allow the state an opportunity to respond to some of the issues that have arisen here. As we close, I really want to thank all of you here for your clarity, that enormous clarity. I think one of you said, all of you said in different ways, this very one true thing, that people fall into homelessness because of inequitable systems. And the more inequitable, the more likely you are to fall into homelessness. And we've heard about the intersectional factors of vulnerability, or I would say risk to homelessness. And then you also said so very clearly, all of you in different ways again, we know what it takes to end homelessness. Simply homes, solutions which are not short-term. And so I thank you for the information that you have given. I thank you for your humanity. I thank you for your empathy, for your kindness, because really these things are about those simple human values, backed up, of course, by good analysis and data. But that's what we want from public policy, things that deliver better lives for all, more dignified lives for all. So I want to close. Andrea, do you want to say something? Andrea wants to close, and I allow her to do that because she's the first vice president.
Me voy a tomar un atrevimiento fuera de protocolo, espero que puedan comprender. Esta es la última audiencia pública que la comisionada Clark tiene sobre asuntos de Estados Unidos y quiero aprovechar este espacio para despedirla. Ha sido una excelente relatora para Estados Unidos y no quería desaprovechar esta oportunidad frente a todos ustedes porque la vamos a extrañar mucho.
So I'll do this for the last time.